of Research at Vistage.
Thank you so much. Analysis of the latest Vistage CEO Confidence Index survey revealed that retention is one of the top areas of priority for CEOs in the area of talent management. In fact, over 3/4 or 76% of CEOs rated retaining existing talent as an area of great importance. While implementing change is a key part of how leaders drive success and improve the bottom line, it's critical for them to remember the impact of change on the employees who are taking necessary and everyday actions to actually implement that change. So in today's session, we're going to review 4 key concepts for you to mitigate the impact of change on your employees and actually increase employee retention in those times of change. Our speaker today is Candace Morton from Insperity. For more than a decade, Candace has used her broad experience to provide guidance to businesses to meet their strategic goals and maintain compliance as an employer. So as we proceed, please feel free to enter any questions in the chat pane and we'll answer them, or in the questions pane, and we'll answer them in the Q&A session at the end. So Candace, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Wonderful. Thanks, Anne. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. We're going to be saving the questions to the end, so let's dive in. We've got a lot to cover. We're going to be talking about retaining top talent in times of change. So hopefully by the end of this session, my goal is that you have a better understanding of the emotional journey that employees are taking while your organization goes through transitions. I'll talk about how to engage employees throughout the process and the role that the leadership team plays in the overall success of a change and the retention of key talent. Lastly, we'll discuss the keys to effectively communicating with your employees as you move through the various stages of a change. Some people may wonder why this is important to discuss. Like many business leaders, the focus is on improved results or higher profitability, whatever desired outcome the potential change is looking to create. At Insperity, we try to remind our clients about the criticality of the workforce to helping to make that vision a reality. We remind them that it's really about the people who produce the products and services. It's the people who turn prospects into returning customers and hopefully into raving fans. And it's the people that show up every day to make that vision a reality. While many are recognizing the value of human capital, investing in people can still be tough. In fact, many times we find that business owners struggle with the idea of investing in human capital being a priority because it can be seen as distracting their primary sales or operational goals. But in the end, while I realize that human capital isn't a line item that you're going to find on the income statement, that doesn't mean it's not equally as important. Honestly, the primary idea here is that people are the foundation for everything that you see on an organization's financial statement, so protecting them is essential. At the same time, change is a necessary part of business. As an organization grows, constantly flexing and bending to meet changing needs is a pillar of success. However, far too often, poor execution creates significant challenges within the organization. During times of change, retaining talent is a challenge. I believe we all agree that retaining key talent and their institutional knowledge is vital for long-term success. So let's start off by talking a little bit about why retaining talent can be difficult during transitions. One of the main reasons retention can be a struggle during times of change is because, as many of you are likely personally aware, we're not wired as humans to like change very much. On the contrary, change triggers in us an innate reaction to protect oneself. This instinctual response is part of our hardwiring as humans and can be challenging to an employer. So let's pick this apart a bit. We have a limit to our mental capacity or bandwidth. We typically focus our attention on where we foresee the biggest impact, whether that be positive or risk avoidance behavior. Regardless, it reduces our ability to be productive toward other tasks. The human brain is wired for socialization and belonging. Research shows that people respond to social pain in the same manner as physical pain, demonstrating that social pain can be just as impactful on your workforce as physical pain. Social pains can be created during execution by not including key stakeholders through the process, especially if the changes disrupt their regular day-to-day lives. Perceived injustice around the change or feelings of being devalued can reduce a person's ability to regulate emotions and be productive. As you can imagine, both can easily be a byproduct of change without appropriate levels of engagement and communication. People operate with a need for security. They fundamentally need to know what comes next. Brains will ruminate and create scenarios until they reach an acceptable level of clarity for their individual needs. All this ruminating results in a lack of productivity and restricts their bandwidth to do their core responsibilities. So to avoid this, it's critical that we provide clear communication, process, and expectations whenever possible. Humans also strive for autonomy, which can often be a primary fear when change efforts are announced. When autonomy is compromised, high performers who typically operate with a high autonomy drive will be the first to leave, resulting in loss of key talent. And it's also really important to remember that our brain constantly scans to see how we're perceived by others. When there are perceived changes, the idea of new team members, leaders, structures, job duties all raise concern around esteem, autonomy, and security. These all trigger very basic needs which our brains will respond to in the simplest, most efficient manner possible. And this rarely results in a logical, methodical thought process controlled by the frontal cortex or prefrontal cortex. Instead, during these times of change, employees are frequently operating in a survival, fight, or flight mode, which is commonly called their reptile brain. The amygdala is responsible for knee-jerk, emotionally raw reactions. And this explains why often in the beginning of a change effort, emotional responses are highest. The final reminder is that the human brain is has 5 times more circuitry dedicated to finding threats, so we will resist anything we perceive as disruptive to our safety. We are literally wired to resist change. And all this to say, what I discussed during this webinar are pieces of information for you to consider and leverage as you plan for your changes. But at the end of the day, change is difficult. So please know nothing you do will likely result in a perfect process free of challenges. I'm hoping that by dipping our toes in the water of the psychology of business, you can take a more enlightened approach to change management within your organizations in the future and alleviate pain when possible. Minimize the illogical, highly emotional responses and mitigate potential impact on productivity. Beyond the individual impact, let's continue our journey further to explore why growth initiatives can be challenging for the organization as a whole. Most would agree that organizations are comprised of many interconnected parts. So in turn, if you make a single change in one area, then there are subsequent changes that occur. It's not dissimilar to the butterfly effect. Unfortunately, many of these changes are unanticipated and unintentional, which makes them far more difficult to plan for. It's critical to recognize that every aspect of a business is connected, so one change can in turn create 10 more. As you think about making changes to the organization, maybe it's something small in scale, like a new vendor, or larger in scale, like revising the sales process, or maybe as large as a merger or acquisition. All of these changes will carry certain implications on your workforce. They will also carry individual assumptions and concerns. One of the best pieces of advice that I give clients is to try to see the situation and potential implications from the viewpoints of all stakeholders. We're going to focus on the workforce during this discussion, but considering all stakeholders can be a critical piece of the process to ensure you're developing a comprehensive change management and communication plan. The first step to success is to have a systemic view of the entire organization and a clear understanding of the goals and objectives of your change efforts. It's critical to anticipate points of resistance and plan accordingly. Here I've listed several of the key drivers of resistance that we'll just be discussing during this presentation. Recognizing what is driving the resistance is an important piece of crafting strategies and key messaging. Understanding the workforce is important. As we all know, humans are complex, dynamic creatures, so everyone will have unique strengths and challenges that may be a source of support or resistance. It is strongly recommended you assess the entire workforce so that you understand their willingness for change as well as adaptability. It's at this point that identifying key influencers can be extremely helpful to support the success of your efforts. Leveraging influencers and champions is a critical component of your future success. Many will fear the unknown based purely on the neuroscience we discussed earlier. There will also be a period of loss around their previous realities and future plans they may have had. It's important to remember that emotions are complex. An employee can be extremely excited about the changes that are coming while still being sad and or frustrated about the loss of their previous reality. Unfortunately, because of lack of engagement throughout the process, employees often feel like the change is happening to them, so there is frequently a low level of trust initially. There can also be an organizational resistance based on the feeling that there was a limited focus of the change. Let me explain this a bit. Some people may have the perception that there are so many other things in their work world that are higher priority that should have been fixed but aren't being addressed by the change. So that being said, they don't understand the entire organizational view to recognize why they aren't actually an organizational top priority. But as we've all heard, perception equals reality. So as a result, the benefit of the change may not be realized by the entire organization because they'll be viewing everything from their own perspective of priorities. Depending on the level of involvement throughout leadership, sometimes we run into a lack of buy-in by members of management, resulting in a lack of alignment and power struggles, which, as you all I'm sure are aware, negatively impact the employees, overall morale, and the effectiveness of the rollout of the change initiative. Ensuring that you have a leadership team as well as key stakeholders engaged and supporting the change efforts are critical to creating long-term sustainable change. It's also important to note here that sometimes we lose sight, not just that emotions can be complex and people can both be happy while still mourning, but we also lose sight that our leadership teams, most often sponsoring and leading the changes, are also employees. And when I say this, I don't mean to indicate that you're not aware your leaders are employees, but rather to say that on top of all of the stress of the transition, which we all know is beyond burdensome on leadership, they're also experiencing all the complexities of change too. I believe this is the most widely accepted change model, so my guess is many of you are familiar with it. Many believe this is the process people go through as they experience change. It's known as the Kubler-Ross model. However, my experience suggests that this is specific to the actual change process as opposed to the next model, which was developed based on their understanding of Kubler's model and what that means for an employee's emotional journey through a change. So let's talk about what that looks like. I want to start by recognizing at first it feels overwhelming to look at this visual. For some, it may even cause a hint of anxiety because it's so busy that you don't really know where to start. I use it intentionally to demonstrate how employees may feel when they first hear about a change. I would imagine some of you decided as you saw this complexity that you didn't have the energy to figure it out. I bet some of you started diving in and trying to dissect it to understand how it applied to you, while others, like during the internal review process here, think that it should be removed because you're not comfortable with it. These reactions are all 100% valid. And they're also 100% valid reactions that your employees likely have when rumors start flying and change is confirmed. The thing I like most about this model compared to others is that, in my opinion, it's the best method I've ever seen that really breaks down the complexity of human emotion and brings it to life. Don't view this diagram as a linear path per se, rather an outline of the variety of places an individual may be at the moment. Everyone reacts differently, and they may spend seconds in each stage or months. It's not always easy to tell from looking where someone is on the journey, but this gives you an idea of the various places you can go as a human. This visual also provides a shared language to use to discuss the emotional experience so that there's some common ground to start from. So number one, anxiety. You don't really know what's going to happen next, and you aren't sure what any change will really look like at this point. Number 2, happiness. You're feeling really good about the change. This will be the chance to get rid of things, systems, processes which you know don't work. Number 3, threat. You're unsure about how the change is going to affect you. 4, fear. You're fearful of the way the change will force you into a new way of thinking, working, and behaving. Number 5, anger. Some anger and frustration are directed at others, especially those who you believe are responsible for forcing the change. Number 6, guilt. You feel angry with yourself for not having coped as well as you believe you could have. 7, despair. You may feel confused and apathetic and really start to wonder who you are. Number 8, hostility. You show aggression towards yourself and others and the change in general. Number 9, acceptance. You become more emotionally detached from the situation and begin to make sense of your environment and the change. And number 10, moving forward. You start exerting more control and make more things happen in a positive sense. Other pathways off the curve are 11, denial, where you deny that any change is occurring at all. Or 12, disillusionment, where you decide that the change does not fit with your value system and you decide to have nothing more to do with it. As you think about employees traveling through this journey, as you can imagine, their individual journeys will start to impact team dynamics, as well as especially if someone is moving to complacency or disillusionment. You can see impacts to morale in many stages, and as you can imagine, this becomes yet another driver of turnover. To really bring this model to life, I want you to think about change that you've experienced in your life, personal or professional. Where are you in this journey as it relates to that change? What are the factors that have driven you along that path? Think of change you've experienced in your past. Think about your journey along this path, managing that change. What experience impacted where you landed on the path? In my experience, they're the best practices that led us all forward, while some fatal errors likely resulted in disillusionment, or the step that isn't on here that I think is really missing, departure. Let's take a look at this journey in action. Now, don't stress yourself trying to read the diagrams. They're for illustrative purposes only. They're here to show that there are two ways that change occurs within an organization, sequential or concurrent. There will be times when sequential will be necessary and others when concurrent is more appropriate. In the diagram on the top left, you have a change you're implementing. Phase 1 kicks off July 1st. Once you announce the change, every employee will start their own individual change journeys. They'll develop coping behaviors and progress through the model. As they're moving through their journey with Phase 1, you start Phase 2, which now the employees are starting a second change journey while still experiencing the first. And as Phase 3 kicks off, you're now introducing a third change journey. Concurrent changes are the same. Let's say you make concurrent changes as you introduce every new change. Please remember that it introduces a new change journey for each employee. As you can imagine, if you have 100 employees and there are 5 significant changes that are trickled out over the course of a year, your employees will each experience at minimum 5 change journeys. You'll have the complexity of 500 change journeys going on at one time. As you can imagine, this is complicated, complex, and challenging, and it is the cause of change fatigue, and in some situations, loss of institutional knowledge through turnover. And so since you aren't able to impact how humans interact with change, what can you do? As soon as possible, engage the workforce in the discussing, planning, and implementation of changes. Involving your employees in decisions that are going to directly impact them is the biggest driver of satisfaction and engagement, as well as ownership and buy-in. Let's talk about what that means. When considering an employee experience, it's important to think about 2 distinct parts: satisfaction, dissatisfaction, and engagement. There's always one critical component that I try to help people understand, and that's the dissatisfaction, satisfaction piece. The key takeaway here is that there are key factors at play that, if not done well, will drive dissatisfaction and potentially turnover. But if done well, they don't promote satisfaction. The best I can describe these would be basic requirements to do your job. Do you have productive relationships with your coworkers and managers? Is there adequate staff? Are you getting paid enough to address your financial commitments? Do you have the necessary resources? And are the challenges and barriers to your day-to-day work addressed in a timely and effective manner? These are the primary drivers of dissatisfaction. Think of these as oxygen, food, and water for humans. You don't necessarily think about being grateful for them every day typically, but if you don't have them, your quality of life is going to drop and you're going to be dissatisfied. This critical piece of information is something I find most people aren't considering during the change management process. When trying to identify the impacts of change, one piece that is commonly left out are the unintended consequences of change. Recognizing the model that I just introduced, make sure you're considering how something will impact those dissatisfaction and satisfaction drivers, and then build your plan accordingly to mitigate the risk. For example, if you know that a change is going to significantly impact one department's day-to-day operations, make sure that you're engaging those employees in the decision-making for increased buy-in and potentially assistance with identifying unintentional consequences that only they'll be able to identify from their unique perspective. When I say to identify the unintentional consequences, it isn't meant to imply that something like this should negate your change or stop your course of action. It means that you should be considering these impacts on things that may make your workforce more dissatisfied prior to implementation and then course correcting as needed. To close out this model, in order to foster satisfaction, make sure that employees feel connected to the work and mission values of the organization. And to foster an organizational commitment, you want to create a sense of belonging across teams, promote personal and professional growth, and autonomy. As mentioned earlier, one of the best practices for leveraging employees through organizational change is identifying champions and using workshops to solution and solve problems or develop plans. This is extremely helpful when planning for change. The other critical piece is that engaging the employees throughout the early stages of the transition allows for you to identify and then leverage key influencers that can help you drive the change throughout the organization. By leveraging key influencers, engaging champions within departments, and leveraging stakeholders in identifying unintended consequences, you'll have smoother transitions and a higher likelihood of sustainability. This also allows you to identify the factors that are driving dissatisfaction that we just discussed that may not appear high in your priority list as a leader, but could be small wins that are high priorities from a priority list for retaining talent. As mentioned earlier, to engage your workforce, leverage the influencers. There are actually analytical tools on the market that can help you identify influencers in an organization. This can be a strong proponent for sustainability of change. If you choose to take a more manual approach to determining the influencers, try to remind yourself that oftentimes the key influencers aren't the people who have the biggest networks or the highest titles. It's often the depth of relationships with the furthest reach that are most impactful. Another best practice to leverage when possible is to find, not appoint, employees who are passionate and knowledgeable about an area that can become an employee's champion or sponsor. They can lead process improvement efforts as a peer rather than having the workforce feel dictated to. This can also alleviate resistance to change and help with the change becoming ingrained into your organization. To engage employees, many organizations will provide vehicles to solicit and act on employee feedback as much as possible. However, the approach may differ depending on the size of the change and organization. Keep in mind that no matter if it's small or not, there still needs to be an organized approach for receiving and vetting feedback and communicating back next steps. This will help employees to feel heard and valued. All of these efforts supports the employee's neurological need to know what comes next, the need for a sense of belonging, desire to be a trusted resource, and the need for autonomy. These approaches allows the primitive reptile brain to relax and allows for the creative problem solving of the pre and frontal cortex to contribute to the overall goal. Since we can all agree that we can't change the process humans go through as they process change, but we can impact how smoothly the change rolls out, it makes perfect sense that engaging your employees and managing the change process would rely on the leadership team. Your leadership team will be driving the change efforts within your firm. So what is within your control is how mindful and planful you are about the changes, how intentional you're being with your actions and what you're communicating, and how you're engaging your workforce. These are all areas that are within your span of control that can ease the experience for employees. It's critical as changes are made that everyone remember that the employee's emotional experience is cumulative. And as we've discussed, the experience can be complex and completely exhaustive in some cases. So effectively planning for change and executing smoothly can be critical to mitigating the impact and retaining top talent. The most fundamental driver of execution is the effectiveness of your leadership team. There's a lot of research out there outlining the most critical leadership characteristics, skills, abilities. So let's dive into how best to leverage the leaders you have in place. Ron Ashkenas, a well-known organizational behavior consultant, said it best when he was talking with Rizwan Khan, a British broadcaster, about organizational change. The announcement is the easy part. It makes the manager look bold and decisive. Implementation is more difficult because no matter how good and compelling the data, there will always be active and passive resistance, rationalizations, debates, and distractions, particularly when the change requires new ways of working or painful cuts. To get through this, managers have to get their hands dirty, engage their teams to make choices, and sometimes confront recalcitrant colleagues. On this slide are a few of the key characteristics that research suggests will help the effectiveness of change efforts. When you're thinking of your leadership team, who comes off as genuine and trustworthy? As we discussed earlier, there's an inherent level of distrust and anxiety for most humans in times of significant change. So having leaders who they see as genuine and trustworthy goes miles toward assuaging that initial anxiety. The next thing is to look for people that can anticipate unintended consequences by thinking strategically. This is a critical, in my opinion, under-considered perspective. The ability to think beyond the next step is fundamental to effective execution. Organizational change, as we discussed earlier, is highly complex. A single change has ripple effects throughout an organization. It's like playing a game of chess. You need leaders that can think about how a single change will impact other processes, procedures, and people throughout the organization so that you can plan and communicate appropriately. Relationship-focused individuals tend to be more effective at supporting employees throughout the change process, primarily because these individuals typically spend a bit more time paying attention to the human side of our workforce. This can also be critical to helping plan for and support employees as they navigate the transition. Transparent leaders reinforce those earlier needs as well. When employees feel like they're being communicated with clearly and honestly, there's a level of reciprocity that helps manage the emotional impact of change while also opening up the possibility to receive two-way honest communication, which can be extremely helpful to the continued success of the transition. Leaders who are empathetic and participative ease the challenges similarly by engaging the employees in the process and remaining open-minded to where the employee is as it relates to their individual journey. I'm sure some people hearing my message may be thinking, we're not in the business of making our employees feel good. We're here to run a business, which is a completely valid statement. So let me take a quick step back to remind everyone that my key message here isn't about making your employees feel good. I'm hoping to help everyone understand that whether we like it or not, as leaders, you are responsible for managing a group of humans that have unconscious biological needs, and that if you take the time to planfully address, you can get better results for your business. Far too often, I feel like people think HR is all about making people feel good, but it's not that. It's recognizing the responsibilities we have associated with addressing the neurological requirements of our workforce. Think of it like computer updates. When your computer downloads upgrades and needs a moment to restart and integrate, those changes into the operating system, typically it prompts you and tells you it needs to restart. If you're like me, you're typically in the middle of managing your 16 open windows, so you hit delay as many times as you can. And because you can't handle the disruption, and we've all been there, I'm sure, you get the computer will automatically restart in 15 minutes, and the countdown begins. You start frantically closing out the windows, hoping that you don't lose any work. And when the computer shuts down, you cross your fingers that you hit the save on everything. This is not dissimilar than your employees going through changes. They need time to restart and integrate those changes as demonstrated by my earlier model. The problem is that you don't want to wait until you get the employee's last day will be November 8th notice, and the countdown to find a replacement begins. And you start frantically trying to close out projects and transfer knowledge, hoping that you don't lose any work, and then the employee is gone. Many businesses now do their updates outside of business hours to avoid such disruption. It's a common practice now. An adaptation, being cognizant about the employee transition process and building that into your process. It is critical to understand the strengths and opportunities of the leadership team, whether you're relying on one-on-one discussions with the leaders themselves, their boss or direct reports, or looking back at performance appraisals. It's critical to understand the strengths and challenges of your leadership team before going into a major change effort. There are an abundance of leadership assessments out there that can be used to evaluate personality style, cognitive ability, skill levels, etc. These assessments can be used to evaluate performance levels, communication styles, and leadership styles. This can be extremely helpful to understand their unique styles and how they navigate and manage change. There are entire companies who do nothing but leadership assessments. If you're open to having a partner, I'd highly recommend leveraging these resources where appropriate. Keep in mind that different assessments will evaluate different characteristics, so make sure you choose one that you feel aligns well with the high impact attributes that are relevant to your organization, as well as the future plans of your organization. Understanding their perceptions and potential concerns can give you an opportunity to validate their feelings of being valued, trusted, and engaged in the change process. All of these will breed great long-term results while providing you with valuable information to use as a leadership team as you collectively navigate your organization through the change. It's important to note here that any information that you're evaluating or collecting should never be used in hiring or firing decisions. They should be used as a conversation starter and the foundation of a development plan when appropriate. I can also not strongly enough recommend engaging a third party or internal resource to educate leaders around the change process, effective change management strategies, and self-management techniques to effectively lead change. One of the most critical components, regardless of who you are as a company, is being an effective communicator. Let's talk about how critical communication is to the ability to maintain institutional knowledge. Communication planning is something that should begin immediately. Several times I've seen leadership take the perspective that because a change is small, there's no need to draft a formal communication plan. My viewpoint is that is a mistake. Spending the time thinking through who needs to be communicated with, what can be communicated, when it can be communicated, and what the potential implications are of that communication, and what the key talking points need to be to support those messages is the only way to effectively manage change. This will allow you to prioritize decisions and minimize redundancies or revisions to strategies that occur due to not thinking far enough in the future. When communicating to your key stakeholders, keep in mind where they may be on the emotional journey so you can provide information to address their concerns in a meaningful manner. Also, vary your approach. There should be multiple methods of delivery of every message. The average human needs to hear something 7 to 10 times before it really resonates with them. Keep that in mind as you're building your communication strategies. Let's walk through a case study together. This was a pretty standard approach to a fairly standard change. Modeli, an East Coast company, was in talks to acquire a smaller 12-employee software company located on the West Coast. I will only be highlighting relevant aspects of the change for illustrative purposes only. Rumors first started circulating about 2 weeks before the initial press release, so overall there was minimal leaking. In order to communicate the transaction, there was a press release announcing the deal, but simultaneously there was an email sent to the entire company and all stakeholders, an all-employee town hall, done virtually since it was a remote workforce, and they launched mechanisms to encourage two-way communication to address any questions or concerns. The communications were very high level with no details, as most initial messaging is, but once the deal closed, they used the same approach and rolled out the messaging. The main message was that business was going to go on as it was in the past with minimal disruption. The leadership team had done some analysis and determined that at this point, that business could remain as is because operations didn't seem to overlap. 2 weeks later, meetings were held to discuss a few minor process changes. These processes were specific around requesting time off, which has traditionally been handled informally at the acquired company. They also communicated the new approval process for final products, which meant all 12 employees of this small company would have to submit their work for final approval to a manager of Modeli. They also discussed that they had evaluated both locations and that they were going to be keeping the West Coast location open. 2 months later, there was a mass email sent out to the employees outlining that several positions had been eliminated. No meetings were held. No additional clarification was provided. 4 employees were no longer with the company. There was no communication that there was a possibility of shutting down the West Coast presence and requiring everyone to move to the East Coast. However, a month later, there were meetings telling the remaining 8 employees that they had made the decision to eliminate the West Coast locations, as well as 2 management positions. Those managers would be given the opportunity to apply to other positions internally. The remaining 6 people would need to move to work out of the office on the East Coast. Within 4 weeks, all employees had quit. They no longer had anyone that was aware of how to operate the software they had purchased, and the software was relatively useless. What was the most significant action that created the negative impact on the employees? Was it 1, lacked long-term planning regardless of changes? 2, trickled changes throughout the process? 3, provided inconsistent messages? Or 4, didn't engage the employees? Well, let's talk about why this is a problem while we walk through the case study together. In the beginning, by all definition, they utilized a best practice rollout. They initially communicated no significant changes. However, initially they implemented oversight into a fairly informal culture and eventually consolidated their offices, requiring employees to move. As you can imagine, while the initial round of changes were relatively small, that didn't change how they did their work per se. They both had significant impact on the employees emotionally because it impacted their perceived autonomy. While the remaining employees still had jobs, this change sent them through yet another emotional journey where most were likely questioning their job security. The final change, requiring relocation, was far too much change to tolerate, and as a result, they lost their talent. Any of the answers to the poll are acceptable because they all have negative impact. However, my experience is a lack of long-term planning and a lack of transparency of what you know when you know it, paired with a lack of engaging your employees for finding solutions and ownership of changes, is a perfect storm for turnover. One concept I like to introduce to business people is the term psychological contract. Many times, dissatisfaction and disengagement from employees is a result of broken psychological contracts. This concept represents the mental model of unwritten beliefs, perceptions, and informal obligations between an employer and an employee. Every communication creates a psychological contract with your employee. Every conflicting message that contradicts the original communication is in violation of the psychological contract and can and often will breed dissatisfaction. Multiple violations typically drive turnover behavior. That is why being planful and intentional in your planning is so critical. So I don't mean to suggest that you have to have all the answers in the beginning, but I do mean to imply that there are things that you can build into your models and plans that will allow you to address those biological requirements and potentially mitigate some of the negative impacts of change. Leverage the opportunity to create engagement and buy-in. The workforce is the most valuable source of information about day-to-day operations, and they'll also be the ones critical to continued success. Provide constant communication, reinforcing your key messages, using as many methods as you can, because it's so difficult for people to remember things due to the rate we take in information. Again, if you think about human fundamentals, the human body sends 11 million bits per second to the brain for processing. Yet the conscious mind seems to be able to process only 50 bits per second. So the more you can say something, the more likely they are to remember it. Keep in mind where your employees are in the journey when you're building your messages. There needs to be a level of transparency and engagement present to prevent employees from seeing the change as something happening to them. And whenever possible, try not to constantly trickle changes out, thrusting them into the emotional process of change and potentially experiencing violations of their psychological contracts. Given the topic of this webinar is around retaining star talent, I wanted to come up with an easy way for you to remember the communication basics when planning for your change efforts. So remember, when building your communication plans, your messaging needs to be sympathetic, transparent, accurate, and robust. Sympathetic to not only the emotional journey of your employees, but also to the biological constraints that we've discussed today. Transparent to share the good, bad, and ugly as much as you can, when you can, to breed trust and reciprocity. Accurate, so you're not sharing half-truths or unbaked plans that cause confusion and damage to existing psychological contracts and the employee's basic biological needs. And robust, meaning that you're communicating every message in multiple ways, multiple times. Many on today's call likely have their own negative experience of change. Well, I personally think Darwin had the right idea when he recognized that the key to success relies in adaptability and responsiveness. In my opinion, both organizationally and individually. I hope that while some of the information that I've shared today may feel fairly academic, that you recognize the value that it carries to you as leaders. It will help you to adapt and respond appropriately as you navigate the complexity of change. I truly believe that as leaders, we are more cognizant to the biological needs and psychological impact of change, will be more effective at rolling out intentional and well-planned changes. As we've discussed a handful of times now, engaging your workforce as much as possible is a critical step to doing that, and making sure you're leveraging the strengths and addressing the challenges of your leadership team will be a big part of successfully navigating the journey. And finally, remembering when communicating your messages to make sure that you're sympathetic, transparent, accurate, and robust will all help you minimize the chaotic experience that change can often be, thus reducing the likelihood of losing key talent to things that are completely within your control. I hope that you found this webinar to be insightful and helpful. My goal is always to provide you with a few resources within my slide deck that you can print off and take with you and as you continue this journey in your day-to-day lives. And with that, I think we're ready for some questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And just as a reminder to everyone that we do have the PDF of the presentation in the handout section of your administrative panel there for within GoToMeeting. Candace, I have a couple questions that were submitted, and one of them is really related to layers. So you talk a lot about communication, and someone shared that they struggle with communication across the board from the top to the bottom. So when you think about all the layers of communication that there are from senior leadership, from frontline managers down to frontline employees, do you have any tips on how to handle that?
Yeah, well, and it's not just all the different layers. Again, it's about each person individually and how they process information. everybody has a different way. Some people are better at processing information when they read it. Some are better processing it when they see it in a video or one-to-one communication. So it's really more about the individual than it is about the different layers. As far as, restricting information, and that, certain layers need to know certain things and not everybody needs to know everything. It's critical that you still, keep a transparent, thinking on and making sure that you come across as transparent and you're sharing as much information as you can that's relevant to each individual's, job. So it's more about, talking to the individuals, and so you need to go through each line manager who knows each one of the individuals and making sure that they understand how best to convey the information to each individual.
Okay, so really the multi-channel platforms, and I love the statistic that you have about, people need to hear things 7 to 10 times to retain it, and maybe in different ways. So I think that was a great takeaway from your presentation.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question about, you asked, talked about identifying influencers and
Mm-hmm.
that there's tools to do that. So I wanted to know a little more about that, but also what about detractors? Are they important to almost engage in this process as well? Like the people that can derail something, that you can get to them first to get them bought in? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. As far as, assessments, there are a lot of them out there. Just make sure that you find assessments that, are specific to your change and, or at least can, understand your style and the culture of the company, and can help with that. But when it comes to, there's always going to be somebody who is not going to go along with change and may try to derail it. Yes, it's definitely important to pull that person aside and do some one-on-one coaching and explain why this change is happening. Of course, that should be done with everybody, but in particular, someone who is slow to making adjustments. They're not very adaptable. Really important to pull them aside and manage that.
Okay, great. Another question we had that was a little bit broader in terms of overall talent retention. So I know today we were focused on communication and change management for retention, but if you look at the broader topic of talent retention, what's the most underrated tactic, do you think?
Actually, I think it's training your managers so that they understand each team member individually and how they like to be treated. Because every person is a snowflake. They need to be treated as such, and making sure that our managers understand that, so that good managers need to be really good listeners and be able to help guide their team members through the change journey and what's going to best work for each team member. So it's really training your managers.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, their managers are your best tool for retention, right? Because people say that people don't leave jobs or companies; they leave managers. So
absolutely, there needs to be trust there.
Oh. Okay, so given how communication normally flows in an organization, how realistic is it to be as transparent as you described? I like your idea about like some people are on, need to know only certain pieces of information. How do you manage that?
Yeah, good question. So really, it's really about telling them, I understand that you guys want to hear more information. At this time, we are only able to, tell you this. We are going to be rolling out the information as we can. But understand that we want to hear what you have to say, and we want to hear any concerns, and that this is a two-way street. We're going to be as transparent as possible when possible, but not everything can be said in one meeting or one town hall meeting. It needs to there needs, right?
Yeah, Yeah, definitely. Well, in the case study you talked about cascading changes. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know, and that the impact of all the change, that something triggers something else. Um, how can you avoid those cascading changes or maybe predict them?
I bet all of us wish we had a crystal ball. Sometimes they can't be predicted. But it's certainly, making sure that you have some strategic thinkers that, before you roll out the change, that can think about those, that you're using all stakeholders, that you give folks some context about the change and why you're making this change. And trying to be doing this with them as opposed to putting this change on them. That's really kind of the best way. Again, try to bring them together with you, saying, we've got to do this together, and we'll listen to your ideas.
Now, how do you handle communicating when you don't actually take feedback on those ideas, right? So I love the idea of involving employees in decisions and collecting feedback, but at times there's got to be something that happens that you just can't act on employee feedback. What's the communication back to help mitigate any bad feelings about that?
Sure. Well, obviously, thank them and appreciate them for their feedback, and that you have taken that into consideration. But there are some, other reasons, whether you can share them or not, why we can't go in that particular direction and why we've just taken this other course of action. Usually giving people a reason why usually helps them understand, the direction that you've taken.
Great. Okay. And so when you're talking about communication, maybe I have a question that just came in. Inevitably, there's going to be people who aren't comfortable with the change. And, I talked about the detractors, but they might attract an audience with how vocal they are about it. How quickly do you deal with these individuals, and how public do you make that?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, you have to deal with it immediately. You cannot let it fester, because they can derail it pretty quickly, depending on how well thought of they are in the company. So yeah, you need to pull them aside. You need to say, I understand that you don't like these changes, or you feel good about them, but that we are going to be doing them, and we need your help in making sure that this goes as smoothly as possible, because we're realizing that if it doesn't, that we're going to have some either key people leave, or the company as a whole's culture will have a scar on it. So again, pull them aside, try to get their buy-in, and figure out why they feel so strongly about it too. Obviously, it's again listening to them.
Okay, so listening to everyone, but giving some special care and attention to those who might make a public display of their thinking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Going back to your managers as a key tool in talent retention, you did talk about leadership assessments, and I have some background in that. But is there one that you might recommend that we use, and why would you use one during change than another?
No, unfortunately, I don't have any specifics, for conflict of interest. But obviously, there are companies that have leadership assessments with change components. They have some that focus solely on assessing your effectiveness as a change agent. And there's some general leadership assessments. It just depends on the situation, how big the change is, how many, does it affect the whole company or just one department? So it really is going to be different for every circumstance and every company. So find one that translates to the unique situation, and maybe it can also be used in future plans. But the best thing is making sure that assessment, that the data actually gets used, because a lot of times you get these assessments and then the data doesn't get used, and that can cause some havoc as well.
Mm-hmm. And are there some that have more, because I know that in some assessments, if you use for pre-hiring, there's questions, and that, there's different reports that you can generate, one that will have interview questions, but then once you have that data on someone who's actually hired, you can use some of those, the data. So if there's any like pre-hire assessments, do you think there's any data that can be gleaned from those?
Oh, certainly. Especially, when you're planning for the change and you haven't rolled it out yet, trying to figure out, who people feel is more trustworthy, who's more personable, and can get people to, open up and talk about their feelings. So trying to figure out who's going to be best for those, who's better strategically, thinking strategically. So obviously you can use those assessments to do that.
Great. All right. So one last question, and going back to that kind of multi-layered communication plan and how important that is, do you have any tools or resources, like maybe a plan that you could share, or just the steps that someone should take in developing a plan?
I don't have anything off the currently. Hoping that you could use maybe some of the slides, that I have here that might be able to help you with communication and just understanding where people are on the process, so that you know when to use different types of communication. But I don't have anything specifically now.
Okay,
Sorry.
so just thinking about all the regular channels that there are, inventorying everything you have, whether it's an intranet or newsletters or town halls or things like that. Just making sure you're leveraging all those parts. Yeah.
That's exactly it. Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, I thank you so much. That was definitely a thought-provoking presentation, getting some great feedback already in the chat field. So appreciate your sharing your expertise today. And thank everyone for attending today's webinar. And do want to invite you to join us for one of our upcoming sessions on December 13th. Kathleen Quinn Vota of Talent Trust is going to share how to develop a talent and culture roadmap for 2020 to make your plan for getting and keeping your best people. So this is another key area, getting and keeping, acquiring talent, retaining talent, and building the culture that's going to be able to help you do both of those things. Very important. So visit vistage.com/webinar for a complete list of our upcoming webinars, as well as links to recordings of past webinars. This one will be posted there as well within a week. And that's vistage.com/webinar. Thank you, everyone, and have a great weekend.